moest ik hem erbij doen. Mute en polling. Welcome everybody to the first Mongi Maduro webinar. We are so happy and excited that so many of you registered for this webinar. And this certainly encourages us to organize more webinars in the future. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to have some practical technical information. You don't have to take notes, just sit back and relax because we will send you the presentation afterwards. During the webinar, your microphone will be automatically muted. If you have a question for Ron, please use the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen to send your question to Ron. He will address as many as possible of these questions at the end of the webinar. You will not see yourself or other attendees on the screen. Because we have a lot of registrations, we limit the face windows to Ron and the panelists of the Mongi Maduro library. You can adjust the way you see the screen, especially if the face windows cover up some of the text that Ron is presenting. You can move around the little face windows that show Ron or any of the panelists when talking. Feel free to adjust it to your preferences. If you have any other questions, yes, just put them in the Q&A. Okay, now I'm gonna introduce our presenter. Most of you know him, of course, Ron Gomes Casseres. He's a well-known person on Curaçao. Most of you will know that he's a retired banker because that is public knowledge. But only a few people know that for many years, Ron is a board member and now on the supervisory board of the Mongi Maduro Foundation. As such, he's also the coordinator of our Mongi Maduro Library Commission. And over the years, Ron has managed to generate a lot of support for our library. So we're very happy with that. Although Ron is a very busy man, because he's on the board of so many foundations, he still finds time to do research on the history of the Sephardic Jews of Curaçao. The article he recently published in the Journal of the American Jewish Archives is a result of his research. And it will also be the topic of this webinar. The governance stipulations of the synagogue Mikvé Israel in the past 3 centuries is the topic, as you know. Well, now I give the mic to Ron, so he can start his presentation.
Thank you, Monique, and good evening to everybody. I am not sure that everybody is seeing me or you, so I will ask Monique and Marijke take a look at that side. Because we are not seeing here, we are seeing the slide, but we're not seeing Monique and myself as for the viewers. Oh, okay, now we're on it. Okay, thank you. All right, good evening, everybody. My thanks to Monique, to Liane, to Marijke for getting us ready today. As Monique just said, this is the first time for the Mongi Maduro Library. It is also the first time for me, and though I like to hold talks and speeches, I must say that I feel a bit handicapped doing this, because while you can see me, I cannot see you. So unlike giving a talk, I cannot see your eyes droop or your head drop in peaceful slumber. So I'm going to try to keep it interesting, and I will try to keep it, as Monique said, relaxing. Some of you may have been looking at the TV a lot in the last couple of days, and that certainly was not relaxing. It was a nail biter, and I promise you that this will be relaxing and not a nail biter. Having said that, I do look forward to welcoming all of you at the Mongi Maduro Library in the future, and every once in a while you might hear a propaganda no paga about the library that is very close to my heart. By being in your own comfortable living room or bedroom or dining room or wherever, the advantage that you have over being at the Mongi Maduro Library today is that you don't have to wear a mondkapje. So just put the mondkapjes aside, relax, and as Monique just said, just listen. Don't try to read everything that's on the slide, because that's a lot, and you will get this the entire presentation in 2 or 3 days at the most. Let me start then with the first slide, which is actually starting at the very end. What I want to next outline for you is what I hope we will discuss and learn today about the Governo Politico da Nação Judaico de Curaçao. With other words, the lay governance of the Jewish community of Curaçao. So what we are trying to talk about today, and what I hope you will learn today from this webinar, is that the Mahamad, and we'll come back on that, the Mahamad, the board, was very firmly in control of the entire Jewish community, not just the religious part of it, but also outside of it in the lives of Curaçao Jews. And that this lasted for quite a time, lasted in fact until the beginning of the 20th century, from the start of the community in 1651 until the beginning of the 20th century, the Mahamad was able to exercise his control over the Jews of Curaçao. Now, why was it able to do that? We'll discuss those reasons, but it owed its authority to many factors, but not in the least to the Dutch colonial policy. And you might say, particularly now these days when we talk a lot about autonomy and what does Holland have to say over us, we're autonomous, you will be surprised to hear how Dutch colonial policy from Holland actually interfered in the daily lives of the Jews of Curaçao. We will learn that the Reformed community, which was formed in 1864, not only brought liberal religious thought, but also more modern principles of governance. And we'll see that that period of time started in Curaçao a complete liberalization of many ways of the Curaçao Jewish community. And last but not least, we will conclude that successful long-term existence and survival demand not only the ability to adapt and the ability to change, as we like to say, change is the only constant in the world, but also the preparedness to change and adapt. So that's what I hope we will learn during this webinar, and seminars and webinars are to learn, not only to listen. But having said that, let me now explain some of the terminology that I will use in this presentation. I've already used the word Mahamad. What is the Mahamad? The Mahamad, I said to you, board. Well, in those days, in past centuries, the board was actually wider than only the Mahamad. But the Mahamad was the governing authority. They were, if you want, the daily board, the ones that had the say and had the authority in the Sephardic community, both inside the synagogue as well as outside of the synagogue. We'll talk about Sephardic Jews, Sephardim. These are, as many of you know, the Jews of Spanish and Portuguese descent, such as myself, since my ancestors came to Curaçao in the 1690s, and the Ashkenazim, of which the majority of Jews in the world today are Ashkenazim. They are the Jews of Central and Eastern European descent, and particularly in the US, the Ashkenazim have a very large majority as compared to other ethnic origins of Jews. We will talk very much about the Haskamot. What are the Haskamot? The Haskamot are, if you want to compare it to the statute, statuten of an association, the regulations of the association, the rules upon which the association, in this case, the congregation, will function, that is the Haskamot. And we will use that word and it will be repeated several times. A word that we will not use that often, but that does come up, is the Chacham. Now, what's the Chacham? The Chacham is just a rabbi, a wise and learned man, a Torah scholar, a scholar of the 5 books of Moses and of our Bible. He is the Chacham. We will talk a lot about Snoah, and those of you in Curaçao know what the Snoah is, and also see it behind me. I'm not actually sitting on that street corner, but it's a beautiful picture that I like to be able to look at and have you look at. But the Snoah is the Mikvé Israel synagogue. The temple that we will talk about also is the Reformed community's house of worship, and we'll show that in a minute also. And last but not least, and I used the word already, I talked about the Nassau, or the nation of Spanish and Portuguese Jews, or the Sephardic Jews. And why the word Nassau, or nation? Because we will see that throughout the centuries, the Sephardic Jews were considered to be a nation wherever they were in the world. And the word Nassau applied equally well to Jews in Curaçao as Sephardic Jews in Curaçao, as Sephardic Jews in Jamaica, Barbados, Holland, London, or wherever they may be. They were all part of this nation, if you want, of Spanish and Portuguese Jews. So a couple of other perhaps explanations. By the way, these are the terminology that I use in this presentation. I am not going to say that you will not find other definitions. You will find other ones every once in a while, but in our presentation, this is what is meant by each of these strange words. A couple of strange words, Sephardim. Where does that come from? For those of you that are not familiar with that word, Sepharat is in Hebrew the Iberian Peninsula, the peninsula of Spain and Portugal, which is why Jews of Spanish or Portuguese descent are called Sephardim. Ashkenazim is a word that perhaps you don't know where it comes from, and it comes from two different sources. More recently, Ashkenaz, the word Ashkenaz in Hebrew is the word for Germany, but it actually is a biblical word. One of the grandchildren of Noah was actually named Ashkenaz. So that is the origin of the word Sephardim and Ashkenazim. I mentioned our two house of worship in Curaçao, and you will also learn that there was at one point a third house of worship, and we'll talk about that very briefly. But the one on the left is the one behind me, the Snoa, which was actually consecrated in 1732, but of a congregation that dates back to 1651, and it was actually the fifth house of worship of this congregation, Mikvé Israel. And on the right, the temple Emmanuel, which was used as a house of worship for the Reformed community, and that building was completed in 1867, consecrated in 1867, and wasn't used until 1964. And we will discuss and learn what happened in 1964. The congregation itself was founded in 1864, and for the 3 years until the building was ready, actually got together and worshiped in people's homes, and the homes of the members. Now, in any organization, and we're going to be talking about control and regulation, or in one word, the governance in the Jewish community. And in any organization, if you're going to be studying who is the authority, who is the governance authority, who is in control, the first thing you would do if you're looking at it for a corporation is you will go to the statute or the regulations. And if you go for an association, you would also go to the statute of the vereniging, of the association. Well, in our case, we go back to the Haskamot, the regulations of the religious community. And our Jewish community, which was founded, as I said, in 1651. So if you calculate it quickly, that means that next year we'll celebrate our 370th anniversary. So in the 369 years since our founding in 1651, there's been a whole lot of these regulations. And here are some of them. I'm not going to discuss these in detail with you, obviously, but these are the Haskamot, the regulations of Mikvé Israel, the original Orthodox community. Now, the reason I show it is not only to show that there were a whole lot of them, there were a whole lot of them, but I want to draw your attention all the way to the left column, where you see some of the dates of the years are in blue. And the reason I have put them in blue is because these are regulations that are actually in their original form, in the original documentation at the Mogi Madura Library, in one of the many collections of the Mogi Madura Library. So there's documents there going back to 1736 and even before that. Now, on the right, you will see some red letters and numbers. And there's two things I want to draw your attention for these Haskamot, these regulations, Mikvé Israel. First of all, the languages in which they were stated. And you'll see that in 1651, 1671, but then I note 1688, they are in Portuguese because we don't have copies of the earlier ones. They were in Portuguese, and they continued being in Portuguese until 1833, when suddenly they were in Dutch. Now, why Dutch? We'll talk about that in some detail later on, but they were in Dutch for a couple of years, but then quickly they went back to the language, to Spanish. Now, why Portuguese or why Spanish? Because those were the languages being spoken in the Jewish community. Those were the language being spoken, being preached, being sermonized in our Jewish community. As a matter of fact, in the synagogue in the SNOA until the 1850s, all the sermons were in Portuguese, and only in the 1850s did they go over to Spanish, and later on in the 20th century also to English. So I wanted to use this to point out that these regulations were in the language spoken by the vernacular, if you want, the papiamento of those days, the Portuguese and the Spanish. But I also want to draw your attention to the number of articles. And nowadays, if you have a statuten of any of an association, of a stichting, you're usually looking at 30, 40, 50 articles. Now, these regulations had between 100 and 200 articles in a regulation. Now, what does that indicate to us? It indicates to us that contrary to today's practice and governance, that regulations actually will indicate authority and responsibility and perhaps function, or who has a particular function. In those days, in these Haskamot and these regulations, they actually also gave specific tasks. And of course, if you go list tasks of various people, it takes a lot more regulations. So we will see how we go from the 80 to 200 articles, and we will see how we actually get down to much fewer than that once the governance is liberalized in our community. So these are just some points to keep in mind without going into the detail of the regulations. But I do want to show this because once the Reformed community split off from the Orthodox community, and that's the first half of the slide, the top half, you'll see again the blue the dates, because these are in their original format, original documentation available at the Mogibadur Library. But now you see that in 1880, they are published in Dutch and in Spanish. They wanted to make sure that as many as possible people were able to read them. So they were actually published in booklets on one side Dutch and one side Spanish. And you'll see how the Temple Emmanuel, which was a Reformed community, and this is part of my comment about liberalized not only religion, but also liberalized governance articles. Now you have not 80 or 100 or 200 articles. Now you have articles, 46, 43, 42 articles, because now we are really talking about the articles giving responsibility and describing responsibility and authority, not describing tasks, as is today the practice in regulations. Now, Mikvé Israel Emmanuel, which is the merger that came about in 1964, again, maintained this practice. So also today, when we talk about statuten, we talk about the regulations, we have a number of articles in the 40s, and then we have also a the bylaws, which have an additional 16 articles, which go into details not included in the statuten and the regulations themselves. So you see how through the years, there was a change both in the language being used as in the number of articles being used. And you see how, as I said before, a large number of regulations that were enforced and that were used over the 369 years of this Jewish community. Now, what exactly did they regulate? What did it regulate? What the power of the Mahamad? What kind of power did the Mahamad have? And we'll cover those in the next two slides. And why two? Because in the first slide, I will cover with you, and it's a very busy slide. I apologize for that, but I want to show you as many examples as possible. It actually talks about the Mahamad, the board, the executive authority in the synagogue, having power over Jews, over Spanish and Portuguese Sephardic Jews, not over the community. And the second slide that we talk about next, we'll see the power it had over the community as a whole. So first, the regulations as they were directed towards Jewish individuals. And if you're able to kind of pick some of these things out, some of them are very normal. There were no disturbances or insults allowed in the synagogue. You have to have proper decorum, of course, but you are not allowed to argue in the streets. You're also not allowed to opening somebody else's meal, or lead a scandalous way of life. And you were not allowed to discuss a religious subject with a non-Jew. Now, if you think that this was an incidental regulation, behind the regulation, I have some dates. This same regulation was repeated in 1688, in 1751, in 1786, in 1809. So this type of minuscule type of regulations were actually repeated over 130 years in the regulations of the Jews of Curaçao. We have a Hebrew school today, and kids are not always happy to go to Hebrew school. In the past, the father would be punished and would actually be fined if children did not attend their Hebrew school. But the members would also be fined if they were assigned a mitzvah, an honor in the synagogue, and they refused to carry out that honor for whatever reason it may be, or if they did not follow the order of the Mahamad, of the board, of the executive authority, or if they were elected to be a particular elected office and they decided, I don't want to be secretary, I'm going to not accept that. Well, they would get fined. They would get fined an amount that was quite high for the times. Or simply being late to a meeting. And how many of us don't get upset when people are late to a meeting and the meeting has to wait till everybody is there? Well, 1756, 86, and 1809, it is stated that people would be fined when they were late to a meeting. The last one I want to talk about is the very last one. And that is that individuals had to pay 1/4% of all goods sold, and that's precisely like that, to the Congregation for the Poor. And that was stated particularly in 1751 and 1786. And if they didn't do it, they were prosecuted by law. Now, all of us know the principle of what's called tithe, which is 10% of your income goes to a religious congregation that you belong to. Well, in this case, it isn't a percent of your income, it's percent of your goods sold. So if you have a business, 1/4% of your sales would have to go to the Congregation for the Poor. Now, this point about for the poor is an important one to stress, because all over the world, Sephardic Jews, Spanish and Portuguese Jews have been and were very conscious of their poor neighbors. The mistaken impression that Jews are always rich and Jews all over the world are rich is simply that, the mistaken impression. And where you actually see this very clearly is actually with Jews coming from Amsterdam. There is a word that is not a pleasant word to hear, but Jews in Amsterdam that arrived from Portugal and Spain, particularly Portugal, that were poor, weren't really wanted to, the richer Jews in Amsterdam, because it was a rich community and a very prosperous community, didn't really want too many of these poor Jews that just came from Portugal around them. So they actually paid for their travel to Curaçao, to Suriname, to Barbados, to Recife, to get rid of them out of Amsterdam. And this group of people were actually called despachos. They were despachado, if you want, out of Amsterdam to go somewhere else because they were poor. And because of that, the Amsterdam Jews did not want them around. So a lot of the Jews that came to Curaçao in the 17th century and the 18th century were actually poor Jews, which is why this regulation existed to allow the congregation to assist the poor. Now, when we go to the next step, which is what is the power that the Mahamad had over the community as a whole? The first one is very, very important as one to keep in mind. And that is a stipulation that we find in the 18th century and the 19th century that, quote, there shall be only one chief congregation, Mikvé Israel in Curaçao, without it being allowed to form any other congregation in the island. So there could only be one chief congregation. The power that they had, they wanted to concentrate in their congregation, in Mikvé Israel, in the SNOA, and not have a second congregation formed that may actually have a different power or may actually interfere with their rights and with their authority. And there is an exception, and that exception is the so-called Otra Banda synagogue, which existed from 1746 to 1815 only. And this was a group of people living in, Jews living in Otra Banda, which were significantly less wealthy than the Jews living in Punda. So they were allowed to have their own congregation as an exception, but only with that congregation called Neve Shalom being subordinate, being under the power of the mother congregation being Mikvé Israel. This existed from 1746 to 1815. It never existed afterwards, and there was never a second other Orthodox congregation allowed or formed in Curaçao. We'll come back to what happened in 1864. But the Mahamad controlled not only if there is another congregation or not on the island, it controlled the religious services and synagogue life. So it not only controlled, as we just saw before, the life of Jews themselves, it also controlled the religious services. It had to provide permission for marriages and for divorce. It had to be present. There had to be a member of the Mahamad, of the board, present to be able to start a service. This was later on slightly amended after 1751 to say that if there was not a Mahamad present, but there was a rabbi present, that could also function to start a service. But for many, many years, for almost over 100 years, there could not be a religious service, even though there was a chazan or a rabbi, without the board being present. They dictated not only the subjects that they wanted the rabbi to preach upon, but also those that the rabbi was was forbidden to preach upon. And it's interesting that one of the things that rabbis were forbidden to preach on, that were not allowed to preach upon, was anything to do with government or politics. And nowadays, that's a little bit difficult sometimes for rabbis to hold themselves to. But in those days, and we'll see later on why, the rabbis were forbidden to preach about anything that had to do with government. The Mahamad often and had a right, as we will see, to go to the governor and the governor in those days was the directeur often of the West Indische Compagnie, until the West Indische Compagnie did not exist anymore. But the governor or the directeur would banish members from the island, and this was established in 1688. So if the members, so there was a member that committed a religious problem or actually misbehaved, the Mahamad could go to the governor and ask for this member to be banished from the island. And this actually happened. It actually happened, and they had that power given to them again by Dutch colonial policy. Now, are we the only ones that had that power? No. And you will understand why if I say that power also existed for Mahamad of the Jewish community in Suriname. Why? Because it's the same colonial power from Holland that dictated over Suriname. And there too, the Mahamad of the Jewish community in Suriname had that power to ask for members to be banished from the country. And last but not least, the only old approval of General Assembly that I could find in the 18th and 19th century was for the Mahamad to dispose of capital or of real estate. So whenever disposal of capital or real estate was required, then they did need the approval of the General Assembly. So you see that the Mahamad not only had power over Jews, it definitely had power also over the rabbi, and we'll see some examples of that, and it had power over the community as a whole. Just an example, and I want to show this only because it does come out of Monger Madura Library, but it became through this study and through the writing of this essay, it became my favorite Mikvé Israel regulation. And it is the regulation of 1756. And you can see, if your screen is big enough on the right, that it's all in Portuguese, as I said it was. It's all handwritten. It's decorated. I find it beautiful on the outside, but it is biting on the surface and in their essence, as we just saw and as we will continue to see. But this became my favorite of the various Haskamot that I was privileged to read and to learn from. Now, the firm control that Mahamad had over Jewish life wasn't something special about Curaçao. I already mentioned Suriname as an example to you, but let's go one step further. And we can see that in Sephardic communities worldwide, the Mahamad was very firmly in control. In Livorno in Italy, which was actually an older community than even Amsterdam, the regulation is state that on matters pertaining to religious law, the Mahamad might consult the rabbi, but had the sole prerogative to decide these matters as well. So the Mahamad in Livorno, Italy, could decide on religious law matters and could use a rabbi only for example. In Barbados, which has also had a very old Jewish community, Sephardic Jewish community, the Mahamad, and I put the name of David Ruderman above, Carl Watson. These are all very well-known Jewish historians or historians of Jewish history. The Mahamad kept a free hand on the Jewish, on the Yedim, and in some cases more so than the religious functionaries were the final arbiters of the maintenance of the Sephardic identity. In Amsterdam, Hamburg, and London, Joseph Kaplan, one of the most famous historians of Sephardic history, writes that in these communities and in some of the colonies of the New World, such as Curaçao and Suriname, efforts were made to install strict methods of communal discipline. Discipline as a supreme social goal existed in all these communities. So this is not something only of Curaçao. It was the Mahamad was firmly in control in Sephardic communities worldwide, and rabbis that came here knew that was the case because these were in the 17th, 18th, 19th century. These were all Sephardic rabbis that knew full well how this game was played, if you want, in other Sephardic communities worldwide. So how is this stated in the 1756 Haskamot? And these are the beautiful ones I just showed you. It's written, and I quote it, the Mahamad had, quote, full authority and superiority in the government of the congregation and could be neither contravened nor contradicted on pain of excommunication or of being fined. Now, excommunication, which is what it stated in 1751 and 86 and 1756, sounds a little bit more than it is. We all know of, perhaps we know of Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza, who was excommunicated and basically set totally outside the Jewish community. That is excommunication in its, if you want, in its total form. Excommunication often in Curaçao meant that for a year you would not be admitted to the synagogue, or for a week you would not, or for a month you would not get any honors. So there were various levels of so-called excommunication or of bans. There were big bans and small bans, B-A-N, without a D behind it. So it's not as heavy as a punishment as it may appear to be, but it could be that. It could also be that, and it existed and it happened, that boards, Mahamad, were contravened or contradicted, and they stepped over to the governor and asked the governor to banish people from the island, Jews from the island. And when that wasn't done, they would go to Holland, to the West Indies Company, or to royalty, and try to get their will done. Now later on, this was changed to being fined, but again, you know, there may be freedom of speech, but it wasn't in those days where talking about or contradicting or contravening the board, the Mahamad was concerned. So let's review a couple of examples of what I call exaggerated control by the Mahamad on the religious process. And for the first one, I'm going to use a little tool, because those of you that are not Jewish and that are participating, and first of all, I welcome you very much to learn about our congregation. But I want to introduce something called a lulav. Now, those of you that are Jewish have seen lulavs waved in the congregation, and a lulav is actually a closed frond of a date palm tree, together with myrtle and willow leaves and a lemon kind of citron, of lemon or limes. And you see that on the slide all the way on the right. And I have made one myself here. And it would look like something like this. What this is, what the rabbi does with this, or a congregant does with this thing during the service, is he waves it. Now, there was a traditional way since 1674 to wave it, because you have to wave it in the four directors and up and down. So it was a question of waving to the east, to the west, to south, to north, up, down. So this lulav is then waved in certain ways. The traditional sequence in our congregation in Curaçao was east, south, west, north, up and down, until we had the Chazan Jesserun and the Rabbi De Sola. They decided they're going to use what then the practice in Amsterdam, and that is south, north, east, up, down, west. Big deal, you might say. Well, they thought it was a big deal. And when Rabbi De Sola in 1745 was ordered by the Mahamad to change and to go back to the east, south, west, north, etc., that had been used in 1674, he refused. And a conflict started, which lasted for almost 10 years. He wrote a very famous piece in which he bemoans his fate of having to, quote, to tend to a flock of wolves instead of sheep. And you know, of course, that clergy believe that their job is to tend to a flock of sheep. But instead, he considered that the Jews in his congregation were wolves. So this conflict continued until 1754, when he tendered his resignation, but he actually won the battle because the change was made to south, north, east, up, down, or west. So this is one of those examples that I think that I use as an example of the exaggerated control of the Mahamad on the religious authority, namely the rabbi. The second example is even crazier. One of the things that Jews do every Shabbat, every Friday, Saturday, is that we drink a very small cup of wine that is accompanied by a prayer. The reason for the wine is to lend a celebratory feeling to the Shabbat as a special and festive occasion, different than any other day of the week. And that prayer in our snore today is Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Borei Hagafen, Borei Peri Hagafen. Now, that was what was being said in Curaçao. That is not what was being said in Curaçao. In 1816, the prayer was Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Borei Peri Hagafen. Until we got this Chazan pizza in 1816, and he said, no, in Amsterdam, they say not Borei Peri Hagafen, they say Borei Peri Hagafen, and both in Hebrew are correct. Well, the Mahamad would have none of this Hagafen, and a part of the congregation would have none of this Hagafen, and insisted to continue with Hagafen, which he was not willing to do. He refused to change. He was suspended. He was then reinstated. The intervention was required of the Governor Keckert and then Governor Kanzler. There was a resignation of a whole group of opposition. They actually added a piece to the cemetery, the old Jewish cemetery in Blenheim, where pizza was not allowed to officiate at burials, including I have an ancestor that is buried there. They proposed to form a second congregation because they could not live with Hagafen instead of Hagefen. This was denied, and not by anybody. It was denied by King William I. And finally, in 1824, 8 years after this conflict started, pizza left for St. Thomas, and this conflict was ended. Now, again, as in the case of Rabbi De Sola, we now here say Hagafen, so you might say that in the end, pizza actually won his battle. Now, I should mention that it wasn't only the Mahamad and the rabbi that were fighting with each other. A lot of these fights actually had to do with interfamily antagonism and clashes within the community, where families were fighting with each other. They would use disagreements or small things like this that would happen, and there were many other examples in history to actually try to talk about their and deal with their own family antagonism to another family. But this was so much so that Curaçao was known as a congregation with a lot of contentiousness, with a lot of continued fights. And this was well known. And maybe today we still like to have all things our way. And maybe that's a little bit of built in our genes and our DNA that goes back to this period of contentiousness in the Curaçao Jewish community. All that, however, is going to change in 1825. Now, why 1825? Well, what happens in 1825 is called the Equal Rights Decree. that is when the Dutch government, the colonial policy, actually declared that Jews have equal rights to all other citizens. Now, what were the rights they did not have before? They could not be part of government or part of politics or in a colonial council. They could not be part of government. They could not be a civil servant, what we call today a civil servant. So there were some disadvantages to being a Jew. They did not have fully equal rights. Now, I have it in, for those of you that read Dutch, I have it here in Dutch. So you can see that in the considerants of this royal decree, it actually says that in verband met de afschaffing der privilegien. So in order to destroy the privileges and abolishing the privileges of the Jews in Curaçao, the Jews there, and also to apply as much as possible the church, the practices of the Israelites in the motherland, in Holland, in Amsterdam, equal rights is declared. So Article 1 says that Jews are gelijkgesteld, equal, but as a result, all privileges are withdrawn, abolished, and destroyed. And these are privileges, by the way, that have existed since 1651 to 1825. So for 175 years, and were in this one article under the, if you want, the excuse of equal rights, abolished and withdrawn and destroyed. But at the same time, what also was stopped in Article 3 was that the burgerlijke macht, with other words, the Mahamad, the nodige hulp zal verlenen, sorry, the burgerlijke macht, excuse me, the civil authority will give the necessary help to the condemnation by Israel's, by the Mahamad, the Israelische kerkbestuur, against members of the membership. So here you see that the burgerlijke macht, the civil powers, the civil authority, was actually giving help to the Israelite, to the Jewish Mahamad board against members of the community, either for niet nalevende godsdienstige plichten, either because they were not following religious obligations, or because of other deeds die niet uit krachten de algemene strafwetting, other deeds that are not punishable by normal civil laws. So this power to go to the civil authority and get things done was also abolished in 1825. And last but not least, but there's many more, but in Article 5 it says the nodige kerkreglementen, the Jewish regulations, religious regulations have to be designed in the spirit that is practiced in the motherland. And we'll see why this is important later on. But basically, the regulations had to be as they applied in the motherland. So, in short, the salient purpose of the 1825 Equal Rights Decree really was one about withdrawing and abolishing rights that Jews had enjoyed for about 175 years, and two, creating additional discipline and control by the Amsterdam Jewish mother community. Two things totally different. One had to do with rights and things that were being done by the civil authority. The other one was to create the discipline and control by the Jewish mother community, and we'll see how that is also exercised. So what then are the consequences of this 1825 decree in Mikvé Israel's regulations? First of all, the rabbis must know and learn Dutch, which was not necessary before, and it's written down in 1833 and 1885 regulations of Mikvé Israel. There was in Holland, starting in 1814, there was a High Commission on Israelite Affairs. Now, starting in 1825, the Dutch government would appoint a representative of the High Commission in Curaçao, which might or might not be a board member, but this particular High Commissioner member in Curaçao would report twice annually to the High Commission in Holland and will advise, inform, and cooperate with the Mahamad and assist to settle disputes. So here is Holland reaching out all the way here, appointing somebody here that will report back to this High Commission in Amsterdam, or in Holland, in The Hague, actually. It also stipulates in the 1833, so the first regulation after 1825, that, quote, within the community there will be no other ritual or liturgy than that of the Netherlands Portuguese Israelites. And that's a very important one. And we'll see in about 30 years why this one is important. But the regulation started saying in 1833 that there will be no other ritual or liturgy than that of in Amsterdam. And last but not least, it also stipulated, and in 1849 it was stipulated, that the language of the prayer shall be Hebrew only. No prayer book other than that recognized by the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam would be allowed in the Curaçao Jewish community. So here you see how that 1825 decree reached very deeply into the governance of the Jewish community, into the rituals of the Jewish community in Curaçao, into the regulation of the Jewish community in Curaçao. And this would continue to be the case from 1825 for the next 100 years. In fact, more than 100 years. So what does this look like? Just to, again, go back to a couple of pictures. On the left is the famous 1825 Equal Rights Decree. There really wasn't an equal rights decree, but it was and it wasn't. It was an equal rights decree, and that gelijkgesteld, you remember that word? The Jews were equal to all other citizens, but at the same time, it took away a lot of powers that the Jews had. And on the right, you see the 1862 has come out, which actually stipulated at the very end that it is sanctioned by the governor on the strength of the April 2nd, 1825 decree on July 18, 1862. So here you have that the governor had to approve, according to that 1825 decree, had to approve in 1862 the statute and the regulations of the Curaçao Jewish community. Now, what gave the Mahamad this power? Now, what gave the Mahamad this power are a number of things, and there's not one thing. I mentioned earlier the colonial policy, which dictated starting in 1820, dictated up to 1825 what happened here. And it actually started all the way in 1651 with a patronship. And a patronship, which existed for the first Jews that settled in Curaçao in 1651, referred to a landholder who got the land from the West Indies Company. Under Dutch colonial rule, was granted proprietary and self-governing rights to a large tract of land in exchange for bringing 50 new settlers to the colony. And the patronship was responsible only to the Director General of the colony. So you see that from 1651 on, there was in fact political autonomy that existed until basically 1825, when all of these regulations came in place and the control was strengthened from Holland. And this same political autonomy was repeated in 1683 by the Amsterdam City Council and in 1685 in Suriname also. Now, why Amsterdam control? Amsterdam was really the authoritative capital of this Nation Nassau, of the Sephardic communities worldwide. In Amsterdam, in the 17th and the 18th century, in Amsterdam, Sephardic policies were determined, were defined, were controlled. Jewish law was controlled there. Jewish court systems called Bedins were held there. Rabbis were trained there, and Chazadim were trained there. So Amsterdam really was a center of authority for Sephardics worldwide. And that's why Amsterdam got this authority over what happened within our community in Curaçao. Curaçao relied on Amsterdam also because when they wanted the governor or the West Indies Company to do something and they couldn't get it done here, it would go to Amsterdam and say, would you go up there in Holland to the royalty or go to the West Indies Company and get this done for us? Sometimes succeeded. Sometimes Amsterdam said, you guys are crazy down in Curaçao. Don't do this and do something else. And we see that the Haskamoto regulation was starting to be approved by royalty in 1759, but it continued because of the decree as we just saw in 1862. Now, there's a couple of local reasons why the Mahamad had so much power. The first one is that there was no rabbi from Kazan, or no religious authority from Kazan Pizza in 1825 when he went to St. Thomas, that we just saw, until Rabbi Chacham Aaron Mendes Chumaseiro, world famous, by the way, Chacham, that was our rabbi here in Curaçao in 1856. So for over 30 years, there was no rabbi. Who then was a religious authority, and who then conducted the services? Who then was the one that kept part, that had the religious practice services continued? Well, basically, it was the Mahamad, or certain members, Parnasim, members of the Mahamad that actually, or of the Parnasim, that actually were the ones that, as laymen, actually conducted the services and were the religious authority. So the Mahamad had everything to say without a Chazan or a rabbi Chacham present. And the other reason was that the Mahamad was constituted by male and wealthy elite without requiring any specific qualifications other than to be male and to be rich. So the congregational powers that be, those that in the congregation had to say as Mahamad, also had to say when it came to giving donations, to financing, or what have you. So they had that power. They have that power in more than one way. Now, that is what was happening in the 19th century, but it was more happening in the 19th century, because the 19th century is the 1800s, is when classical liberalism took hold, first in Britain and then in other European countries. Liberalism, as we know it, became preeminent, the preeminent reform movement in Europe during the 18th century, during the 19th century, during the 1800s. And this was the case also in Judaism. And that's where Reform Judaism came about. It started in Germany, it moved from Germany to Britain, and then from Britain it blew over to the Americas, to Charleston, South Carolina, which has the oldest Reform community in the Americas, and then to Curaçao. Because in Curaçao in 1864 is when a schism, a breakdown within the Orthodox Mikvé Israel community happened, and it was led by reform-minded members. Now, that has been, that schism, that break apart, has been discussed in many ways. I'm not going to go into the details, but there were personal issues involved, as I said before, family rivalries. There were economic issues involved there was economic motives between two major families. There was a Orthodox Mahamad that was supported by this Orthodox Chacham Mendes Chumaseiro, who went to Holland to lobby for orthodoxy. But I think that Maurits Chaldeket, who was a minister of the Reform community, said it best. He wrote that originally, outside of religious considerations led to the schism, but then paralleled with this, with an influx of newly important Jewish ideas. So what happened in 1864 or 1860s, really, because this took some time to come to fruition in 1864. What happened in the early 1860s was perhaps personal, perhaps economic, but it also was religious. And as we will see, also governance stipulations were liberalized then. So it also had to do with people that were liberal thinking, and were liberal thinking not only in their Jewishness and in the religious approach, but also Jewish thinking in their governance stipulations. So there was a break apart. The liberal group broke apart. It started with 26 members. It soon had 105 members. Within 4 years, it had 195 members, and mostly of these are ex-Mikvé Israel members that moved away to what became Temple Emmanuel. Now, did Mikvé Israel notice this? Oh, yes, it did. One of the things that the liberal group wanted to have is they wanted to have organ and music. And in 1866, Mikvé Israel installs that beautiful organ that is still played today, but as a consequence of losing members to Temple Emmanuel, where a in Oregon was installed from the very beginning. But there were other differences. There was no difference between men and women at the Reform community. And there was no requirement that you had to be a Sephardic Jew to be able to be part of the membership. So this was the end result of a very nasty squabble and a very nasty struggle, and it was truly nasty between 1860 and 1864, and the new reforms, the Reform community's new governance shows us how it is quite different. And I'm not going to go into the detail, but let me just say that there was a clear separation of church and state. There are no listings of do's and don'ts of the religious leader and the regulations of the liberal, the Reform community. There was sharing of responsibility. There was no difference between man and woman. There was no differences in how Jews will be buried. The cemetery of the liberal community was open for all Jews, and there was no differentiation of ritual. And there was no Mikvé Israel, in order to keep its members, would not allow a member of Mikvé Israel to be a member of Temple Emmanuel also. So you either had to become a member of Mikvé Israel or Temple Emmanuel, according to Mikvé Israel's regulations. Temple Emmanuel could not mind if you remained a member of Mikvé Israel. So there were a lot of changes that were the type of reform and liberal changes that today we would consider to be acceptable practices. Now, let's stop here for a minute about regulations and just talk a little bit about how the relationship has developed between the Rabbi and the Mahamad, because after all, I did say that we went from conflict between Mahamad and Rabbi to Concord. And on this slide, what I've tried to do is put for you what has happened from 1833 to 1896 on the road to sharing of responsibility. So following the 1825 royal decree, you will remember that I read to you 1833, there would be no doubt that the position of the rabbi towards the Mahamad. And I read to you the rabbi as church official is completely subordinate to the synagogue's board and will ensure that no other rituals or liturgies than the Dutch Portuguese Israelites. So this is what was valid in 1833. And there were, in the total of the regulations, there were 14 regulations that actually discussed what a rabbi was allowed to do and not allowed to do in the 1833 regulations. In 1875, the 14 became 12 regulations, 12 articles that regulated what a spiritual leader was allowed to do or not. And now, for the first time, there is an appeal possibility. So there's a Consejo de Ancianos, a board of a council of the elderly, to which the rabbi could actually appeal if the Mahamad did something that the rabbi considered to be not appropriate. So we go from the completely subordinate to now the possibility in 1875 to appeal to a council of elders if there was something that the rabbi did not agree with. 1885, we see that this long list of 14 articles have now become 12 articles as it relates to the rabbi and 2 for the cantor, for the chazan. In 1896, it becomes 5 articles and 1 for the cantor. So slowly, we see how this detail of what the rabbi was allowed to do and not, and how subordinate it was to the synagogue's board or not. And it would slowly changes from 14 to 12 to 6 to 5 articles. And then when the Reform community comes along, there is only 1 article which states duties, the duties of the religious leader are as described, approved, and instituted by the Mahamad and the General Assembly of members. So now it states that not the Mahamad, but the membership, the General Assembly of the members, has to describe, approve, and institute the duties of the rabbi. So you see how we go from a Mahamad, which has all powers over the rabbi, to basically a situation we would recognize today that membership has that power. Now, there is one stipulation, which is interestingly included in the 1880 regulations, which says that no incisive changes in ritual may be made without 3/4 vote of General Assembly and only after advice of the religious leader. Now, why is this important? Because when these Reformed Jews came along, they wanted to safeguard the Reformed Jewish ritual. They didn't want a crazy rabbi or a crazy minister or a crazy board, Mahamad, to simply change the ritual that they wanted to have as Reformed Jews. So they basically said that the General Assembly had to have a 3/4 vote to change, to make an incisive and important change in the General Assembly, in the ritual of the congregation. And you know what? That stipulation of 1880 still exists today in 2020 in the regulations of Mikvé Israel. So really what I want to say here is that religious liberalization, which is what Reform Judaism was about, also brought along with it more liberal and more modern governance. And it's important to realize this, because we see this continued now as in 1964. Because what happened in 1964? In 1964, the liberal Jewish community, Temple Emmanuel, and the Orthodox old Jewish community, Mikvé Israel, realized that they're two Jewish communities of the same backgrounds, the same culture, of intermarried families, but they were apart for 100 years, because they were apart from 1864 and to 1964. The house of worship were different. One was the Snoah, the other one was a temple. But more importantly, most of the Mikvé Israel families were not really fully Orthodox. They would open the stores on Saturday. They would ride a car on Saturday, or they would have somebody row them from Otrabanda to Curaçao, from Scarlo to Punda on a Saturday. So they came to a realization in 1964 that there was no reason to remain separate. However, the rituals and regulations were quite different. And also, the religious leader at Temple Emmanuel was Ashkenazi and Reform. And the 1825 royal decree, you may remember, said that in the future, only the ritual liturgy of the Dutch Portuguese Israelites, which are Orthodox Amsterdam Jews and Amsterdam Jewish community, could be followed. So the ritual had against them and the regulations were against them, and the fact that Temple Emmanuel did not distinguish between Ashkenazim and Sephardim. So the key discussions of the merger were not so much Orthodox versus Reform. They were really, how do we maintain the traditional Sephardic Torah service in our new merged community? What do we affiliate with that allows us to be liberal in our thinking, but more traditional in our ritual? And that they found in the Reconstructionist movement. They agreed in a transition period. During the first year, there were two presidents. The Emmanuel president and the Mikvé Israel president were joint presidents. And afterwards, 1 year, one was president, the next year, the other one was president. So they agreed on a transition period. They eliminated to start eliminating gender inequality and to accept Jews of all heritage, Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazim Jews, in the new combined Mikvé Israel Emmanuel congregation. And the governance would become one of shared responsibility and a separation of church and state. So all of this actually came about in 1964, but continued for quite a while later, because acceptance of full egalitarianism, full equality between male and female in governance and in the ritual of the combined community continued as a sometimes tense and sometimes a difficult period from 1976 until the year 2000, at which point the congregation realized that egalitarianism, full egalitarianism in governance and ritual was crucial to the continuity of the congregation. So let me, because of time considerations, only cover with you some of the lessons learned, and it's not all the lessons learned, but some lessons learned. First of all, the Mahamad letter ruled the Jewish community for over 200 years. Similar authority existed elsewhere, as we've seen in Sephardi communities. And this led to contentiousness and schisms in the Jewish community often due to overlapping authority of the Mahamad, Dutch colonial governance and privileges, the Amsterdam Portuguese Israelite community's interpretation of Jewish law and practices, and royal decrees. Now, secondly, a second lesson, the Dutch colonial policy had direct and indirect impact on the Jewish community. The privileges of self-governance that were granted by the West Indian community with patronships in 1651 and 1659 were slowly removed in 1825 when the privileges were removed and equal rights were granted. There was a strict adherence required to procedures and rituals of the Amsterdam mother community, not imposed by Amsterdam, but imposed by the colonial policies. And equal rights also led, but one consequence of that, which I haven't covered, that's a part for another webinar perhaps, also led to significant representation of Jews in the colonial council and the Koloniale Raad as of 1844, including as president of the Koloniale Raad and sometimes as a majority of the Koloniale Raad. And last but not least, I want to end with what I started with. Successful long-term existence and survival demand the ability to change and adapt and the preparedness to do so. The Mahamad lost its privileges and absolute authority after 1825. State and church were differentiated, but Mikvé Israel today is egalitarian with modern principles of governance. And a change, as I said earlier, is constant even after almost 370 years and will continue to do so. So thank you for attending. Thank you for your attention. Thank you especially for your interest in the history of Curaçao's Jews. Thank you again to the great folks and to Monique, to Marijke, to Lian of the Monge Madur Library. I will now try to answer some of the questions you have typed in. And with that, we'll ask Lian to come back on screen so that I can hear any questions that she will read on to me. If I don't get your questions, I will look at them and I will try to get to you personally. And if I don't get to you, you get to me, and I will be happy to answer your questions. So, Lian, it's all yours.
Okay. Good evening, buon noche, everybody. We are very honored to have you here at our first Monge Maduro Library webinar. It was an honor to have Ron to do our digital kickoff of our lectures. For those who joined us a bit later after the introduction of Monique Alberts, our manager, I would like to, like Ron already said, you can type in your questions in the Q&A and we'll try to address as much as possible of those. Ron, thank you much for your presentation. It was very enlightening. There were keywords that you used, which were very interesting. You had control, autonomous, how the community adapted and changed. Just to introduce the questions, as you said, your presentation was about the Heskemot regulations of the Jewish community, and it was interesting how you addressed the firm control that the Mahamad had through the various regulations, that they had also they could rely on the colonial government and the Dutch Portuguese congregation to exercise the firm control on the Jewish community in Curaçao. And through all the regulations, you specifically addressed two important developments, which were the emancipation of the Curaçao Jews in 1825, and also the schism, the breakaway in 1864 of the two communities, and how this also had its impact on the control the Mahamad had, but that this firm control specifically was surely transformed into a more liberal and modern governance, with the resulting in the merger of the congregations. So this just for an update of those who joined us later. I want to kick off with a question we received from Peter Fontilius from Curaçao. He asked whether in the old days, did the head of the other churches, the Catholic and the Protestant churches, have the same powers as the Mahamad?
That's a very interesting question. I can only answer half of it, because in the same period of time, that the Mahamad was exercising this power. Those that know the history of Monsignor Nieuwent, when Monsignor Nieuwent came to Curaçao, there was a problem in the Diocese of Santa Ana, and there was a problem with the lay community. Well, in the end, he ended up actually getting rid of the laymen of the community at that church, at that diocese. So it is quite different, of course, because in the case of the Roman Catholic Church, there is a Vatican, there is a Pope that has the ultimate power. That does not exist in Judaism. In Judaism, there is no such, there are different movements. The movements will have their different rituals and the different regulations, but it is not the movements that you associate with has no say over a movement here. Now, while of course in the Roman Catholic Church it is different, in the Protestant Church that is also slightly different, because there you have the synodos, and the synodos do have some power on some greater influence, if I may use that word, on congregations that belong to a particular synod or to particular directions of Protestantism in a particular direction. I must say it's a very interesting, Peter, it's a very interesting question. It is one that would require more work, but I think my answer to the specific question, whether the same type of power existed in the Protestant and the Roman Catholic community in Curaçao, is no, it did not exist.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to combine two questions here because I think they're related a bit with each other. Roy Maduro specifically wants to know, he's happy to learn more of our descendancy. His question is, who were in general the Mahamads? And Barbara Perquin has a question whether there were a total gender equality for all functions.
Well, let me answer both of those separately. Roy's question about who were the Mahamad, they were, as I said, the richer male members of the community. And the names are the names you associate with the Jewish community. There were Cohen Enriquez's, there were Jesuruns, there were Maduros. But it was always, it was those that had more power because their, let's say, the influence because of their financial abilities was also heavier. So there were male wealthy members and elite members. There is a reason why the Mahamad, for those of you that know our synagogue, the Mahamad, the banca, as we call it, where the board sits, is set higher than the membership. And that's because they had a higher power. So that higher power is actually still today reflected, but not executed, not in the regulations today, but it's still there because they sit higher. They actually sit in is the coolest part of the whole synagogue. And it's the only attraction now to be a board member. But in the past, to be a Mahamad meant that you had real power. You could make that power actually work in the community. Now, the question asked, was it gender equality? At Mikvé Israel, there was no gender equality whatsoever. There was no gender equality in the Mahamad, as I said, so in the governing authority. There was also no gender equality in the ritual. The ritual was solely for male. Women in Orthodox Judaism sit in a place where they would not distract the male members from their worship. So in Curaçao, that meant that in the synagogue, they would sit on the balcony upstairs and not really visible by the worshiping male downstairs. So there was no gender equality in ritual. The honors, whether an honor was given to carry the Torah or to what's called an aliyah, to read a piece of the Torah, were given only to male members. Now, at Temple Emmanuel, from its very beginning, there was gender equality. There were female board members at Temple Emmanuel, not from day one, but in 1864, when the merger with Mikvé Israel happened, there was a female member. And the question then was actually, what do we do with this female member? Because the new regulation would say that any board member that has been a board member for two years would be considered to be a member of the Council of Elders. But how could you have somebody in the merged community to be a member of the Council of Elders, be a woman, if women were not allowed to be on the board yet? So it was a nice, interesting conflict at that point. But slowly at Mikvé Israel, first in 1976, there was a change made from starting in 1864, with the first change made that women were allowed to sit downstairs. Women would be counted as part of the minyan, the number of Jews needed to start a service. Then the next step was, after a number of years, that women would actually be members of the board. In other words, there was equality in governance, but not yet equality in ritual. And finally, full egalitarianism in the year 2000 brought with it full egalitarianism. Women would now be counted in Mikvé Israel Emmanuel, as it is today, both in the governance as well as in the ritual. And if I may add a personal word to this, it's not from any regulation. I firmly believe that has been one of the reasons why Mikvé Israel today continues to exist, is because of the fact that our boards have had and continue to have women. We have members that have been president of the congregation that are women since 2000. So we do have now finally, but this was not the case before 1964, egalitarianism.
Okay, thank you. I'm trying to sort through all the questions because we are receiving, or actually you are receiving quite some compliments, Ron, of several people who are thanking you for a very enlightening and informative lecture. Sydney specifically wants to know how many board members made up the Mahamad, and how and by whom were they appointed, which is also, I guess, related with the question that Crystal Monsanto has, which is, was there a stipulation how many members are Parnasim, or is the size of the bench an indication?
The size of the bench is an indication of the Mahamad, which originally was 5. In 1864, it was expanded by taking away some armrests to make it for 7. So right now, if you go in there, there's 7 seats, but it used to be for 5. And the Mahamad was the 5 persons. Now, the Parnasim was much wider. So there were Parnas, as they're called. There were Parnas that were in charge of the cemetery. There were Parnas that were in charge of services that would actually, if the rabbi was unable to hold the service, would hold the service. Or in a period of time that we didn't have a rabbi, would actually hold the service. But the Mahamad was normally 5 persons. Now, who elected the Mahamad? The membership elected the Mahamad. Now, how they made sure that the right people were elected, I think that you don't have to think about elections as being the democratic process with or without nail biter that we actually experience either in our congregation or watching the US elections on TV today. So it wasn't a democratic process. It was who had the most to say. I've often said, and it's not a correct, what should I say, comparison. But if we go back to how these first Jews came to Curaçao, the first Jews that came to Curaçao, 1651, were led by a gentleman by the name of João de Ilan. And João de Ilan had to petition the West Indian Company for permission to bring 12 families to Curaçao, and came to Curaçao and with those 12 families, and the West Indian Company gave them a piece of land, which today is part of the refinery, which in due not too far from the old cemetery. So who would actually have the say in those 12 families? It was João de Ilan and perhaps some of the people that he was closely associated with. And so it happened that the next group that came in 1659 was a larger group, a group of about 70 families. Now that group also had a leader. That leader in the end ended up being the leader of the community. So there was, I don't want to call them tribes, but I will call them that there were groups that had people that they respected, that were the leadership, and that leadership is what ultimately became the Mahamad. So there wasn't, while they were elected by the membership, they were not elected by the type of democracy that we know today.
Yeah.
So hopefully that answers both how they were elected as well as how many members there were.
Yes. To all those who are asking, yes, it will be able to see this webinar again because we are recording it. And so we will be sending it to all those interested, and we will be also be posting it on our Facebook page and other social media platforms. I have a question. Roberto Fels wants to know if you have any examples of behavior that could have a congregant be excommunicated.
Yes, I do have examples, and generally, what they did is what I said. They were not excommunicated the way Spinoza was put outside of Judaism. They were put outside the Jewish community, so they were not allowed to participate in the Jewish community. They would not get any honors in the Jewish community. Of course, they could pray, but they would not be talked to. They would be shunted by the board, by the Mahamad, or by the rabbi. So they were not considered to be part of the Jewish community, usually for a particular period of time. Excommunication is actually an interesting concept, because real excommunication, what Baruch Spinoza was subjected to, being put outside of Judaism altogether, became very unpopular because it created a lot of controversial issues within the Jewish community itself. So some historians have argued that excommunication actually gave Judaism a bad name, and therefore should not be carried out in its totality. And I think that's one reason why in Curaçao and in Amsterdam also, by the way, there was excommunication, but there were different levels of bans rather than the ultimate level, which we know of Spinoza and some others in Amsterdam, but not in Curaçao.
Okay, thank you. I have a large question here. I'll read it. It's from Harlan Patricia. The split between Mikvé Israel and Emmanuel took place in 1864, which was in the same period as when the walls of Willemstad were pulled down, right?
Right.
So two Jewish families had the main contacts to pull down the walls and gained significant wealth through these contracts.
Right.
One could imagine that these changes in wealth could have led to social conflict within the Jewish community. Could this have played into the schism in some way?
Oh, absolutely. If you recall, I said that there were commercial and family reasons, and the questioners are very knowledgeable people about Curaçao Jews, and the commercial antagonism that existed between the leader then of the Orthodox community, which was Maduro, SAL Maduro as we know him today, and the leaders of the Curaçao community, of the Reform community, which was a combination of Jesurun and Cohen Enriquez, had everything to do with demolishment of the walls, which ultimately was granted to the group composed by a young, dynamic SAL Maduro, rather than to an older Jesurun family. So yes, it had everything. The commercial part had everything to do with it. However, the reason I said that it's not only commercial part is because if it's only commercial part, it would end there, and you would actually have a second Orthodox community. You didn't have a second Orthodox community. You had a community that after a few years had regulations that were very modern, that were very liberal. You had a organ installed without any discussion from the very beginning, because they wanted to see music, they wanted to have music, they wanted to have an organ installed. You had, by the time they had their first rabbi, you had a Reform rabbi. So had it only been that issue about the commercial issues, I think we would have seen a second Orthodox community, rather than a community which within a few years had a regulation which separated, as I said, church and state, which separated completely the power of the new board of the temple, of what became Temple Emmanuel, on the rabbi. So my conviction is, as Chaldecat has written, that yes, there were commercial issues, there were family issues, because there were other families that moved on. And again, I use myself. I'm a Jews of ancestors. I had ancestors that moved from Mikvé Israel to Temple Emmanuel. They had nothing to do with the the families that they had to do with the walls and the structure of the walls. But they were Reformed Jews from the very beginning, that they joined Temple Emmanuel. Later on, they married the Cohen Enriquez's within the same Temple Emmanuel. So yes, it was an issue, but I don't believe it was the only issue. And my theory is borne out by among other Gaudekat and some others.
I have a question from René from Wijngaarden, who's asking whether you know of the names of the families who were strongly pro-Joshua Pisa to leave the congregation.
I can find it, yes, but
Maybe
I
we
don't.
can email him.
I will email René, yes.
Yes, okay. I have another question. I guess we have time for 2 more questions. I'm not sure if I understand this, if I'm asking it correctly, because it's from also an anonymous attendee. The question is, to what extent the loosening of the Mahamad rules were responsible for the end of the Spanish-Portuguese community?
That's a very good question. Let's first start by saying that there has been no end to the Spanish-Portuguese community. We exist still today, and as a matter of fact, within the Mikvé Israel community, within the SNOA, some 54% of our members are Sephardic Jews, or descendants from Sephardic Jews. However, as I said from the very beginning, we did not make, Temple Emmanuel did not make a distinction between Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews. And that's an interesting concept, because at Mikvé Israel, as in Sephardic communities around the world, they are only accessible to membership, at least they were only accessible to membership of Sephardic Jews. And from the very beginning, that stipulation, which I've called ethnic origin, was not one of the requirements of Temple Emmanuel. I interpret that Temple Emmanuel and the Reformed community was more interested in their liberal Judaism, in the liberal execution of their liberal theology, than they were interested in maintaining the Sephardic heritage. Now, that sounds like a heavy statement, and it's a heavy statement which my father would get very upset about, because he actually got a Zever Ayer for his efforts to maintain with the Jewish Museum the Sephardic heritage. So what I'm saying is not entirely correct, but I think that the Reformed community decided that their principle was the Reformed theology that they wanted to follow, and not as much be tied to the fact that Sephardic Judaism in those days and in the next 100 years only knew Orthodoxy. And I must say that even in 1964, when the two organizations came together and merged, and therefore Mikvé Israel, SNOA, also started officially, unofficially it happened before, officially getting Ashkenazi Jews, this was a unicum. This did not exist through the rest of the world. Sephardic communities were only Orthodox. Sephardic communities were not liberal communities anywhere else in the world than in Curaçao in 1964. So what does this tell us? This tells us that the Jews in 1964, when they merged, were interested in maintaining Judaism in Curaçao, maintaining the practice of Sephardic Judaism, Sephardic rituals, such as exist today still in our congregation. Every Saturday morning, when we have our Torah service, part of our the prayer that we say for royalty is in Portuguese. The blessings that are given in the Saturday morning service are in Portuguese. So even today, we have Sephardic, Portuguese, Orthodox practices within this liberal community, and that is part of what the compromise was in the merger. It did not refuse entry to non-Sephardic Jews. It opened up entry to Ashkenazi Jews according to the ritual that was adopted, which was a liberal theology combined with some Sephardic rituals that go back to Orthodoxy. So yes, we're still there. And you know what the interesting thing is? that many congregations in the world, even Orthodox Sephardic congregations today, also admit non-Sephardim as their members, including in Amsterdam. So some of what was started to happen in Curaçao in 1864 and then 1964 are happening elsewhere in the world. But being on this small community, being on this small island, being in the small community of Jews today, not over about 150 Jews, we have to be able to be more flexible, and we have to be able to come to compromises, and that is what has been done to maintain liberal Judaism in Curaçao, and I hope will continue to be done for many, many decades to come to maintain liberal Judaism in Curaçao. But to continue to be, to have part of our service be that Portuguese Israelite one that we inherited from our Sephardic forefathers, never forgetting that they are where we come from, and they are the ones who constructed a beautiful building behind me that we worship in every Friday night, every Saturday morning, and every holiday.
Yes. In the context of that, I have a very interesting question of Tamira La Cruz, which other participants also say they want you to answer that. It's actually about, because you're saying very correctly about the continuance of the Sephardic Jewish community in Curaçao. But as Tamira is asking, you mentioned the contentions in the Jewish congregation, perhaps being part of the DNA of the Curaçao community. So what are the characteristics of the Jewish community do you think are in the DNA of Curaçao?
Oh, very many. In our papiamento, there's many, many words in papiamento that actually are words that Sephardic families used to use in their families. And the oldest written text in papiamento was actually a love letter between a Jewish man and a Sephardic Jewish man and a married Sephardic Jewish woman. And this is actually the oldest written papiamento that we have not in our history, but in Curaçao's history. So there's very much in our Sephardic history that we find back in our language, in our papiamento, in our culture, in our food. There's many things that for Sephardic families used, but that they weren't necessarily Jewish. It is said that the keshi yana is actually something that originated in Jewish families that would buy the round Dutch cheeses, cut off the top, scraped off the inside through the course of eating the cheese, and then use the outside of it to actually put the delicious chicken or meat or whatever it may be in there that today we know as a. Now, there's nothing religious about that, but it is an old tradition of Sephardic families. But you've also heard of a pan levi, which is a kind of a cracker or a biscuit that we eat. Now, that's a pan levi, and a pan levi is the generation and the groups of spiritual leaders in the Jewish community and the Levis, and that's where pan levi comes from. And so you can continue with a lot of cultural, food, papiamento language that are all part of our Jewish community. So, yeah, Tamira, there's a lot there, and I hope that it will continue to be and honored as such also as it is today. But one thing I will say that I think I say with pride is that the Sephardic community very much is part of the Curaçao community and will always continue to be part of the Curaçao community. And much of the economy of Curaçao in past years, the shipbuilding, the finance, the insurance, the Panama hats, and so on continue, were all things that were brought here or were part of the Jewish community, of which we're quite proud, and things of which we are less proud. During the slavery period, Jews also had slaves. Usually they were household slaves or they were craft slaves that were in the businesses. But that's an area that we're of course not at all proud of, but it's a reality that we have to see under eyes, and we have to today also apologize for our ancestors. But it doesn't take away the huge contributions to the community and the economy of Curaçao. So for all of that, let me leave it at that, because I can probably continue till tomorrow morning on various aspects of our history. But to thank you again for attending, but to thank you especially for your interest in the history of Curaçao Jews, to thank you, Leanne, for the questions, and you, Monique, for the introduction, and even though not on screen, to Marijke for taking care of the technical part behind this.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Ron. I'm going to pass on the mic to Monique. But for all the questions which were not answered yet, you can email us at info@madurolibrary.org or at Ron's, and we'll try to address them anyway. Monique?
Yes, I would like to thank Ron and also all the attendants for their interesting questions and staying with us the entire webinar. And if you have any other questions about Jewish history of Curaçao, of course, you can contact us. You can visit our library. You have to make an appointment first. And if you would like to see the archive of the synagogue, Mikvé Israel, you can also send in a request to the synagogue, and you could also maybe get some information from that. So I would like to...
I will interrupt you for a second, if I may. I bragged about the beautiful building behind it. I want to brag also about the beautiful buildings behind Monique.
Yes.
On the right, all the way in the back, the Roy Katochi Landhuis, which will very soon, probably next month, open a beautiful, totally renovated museum. And on the left part of the picture, the very modern pavilion Ina Maduro, Dankmai Maduro, which is the library itself, the Mongi Maduro library itself.
Thank you very much, Ron. Yes, I forgot to add that. And so you're welcome to set up an appointment with us, and you can visit our library. And in a few weeks, the new museum will also open. So yes, I want to thank you again, and we will certainly organize more webinars in the future. So have a good night, and thanks again for being with us and attending our webinar.
Huh?